Dr. Hadas Cohen is here for this year and next as our Israel Institute Teaching Fellow. It's sort of a supercharged postdoc, and we're awfully glad that she's here with us. Has already added an enormous amount of energy and programmatic activity, and was gracious enough to host our film festival, which those of you, if you saw the movies, they were not ones you would bump up against ordinarily. It's not Tevye or something that you watched 30 years ago. So she really knows what's going on in Israel today. She's also teaching a couple of classes here and in international and area studies, and we'll be teaching a couple of compressed classes in the spring, which means for those of you who aren't students or faculty at OU, she will be starting her class in mid-March and teaching it through the end of semester. So if you're looking for a couple of classes that don't begin in January, I recommend Dr. Cohen's classes. Hadas is a student of contemporary Israel with interests in gender and law. She holds a law degree from, what is it, Bar Ilan? No, from the Hebrew University, excuse me. From the Hebrew University, I think some of you have heard of it. It's a little university over in Jerusalem, and holds a master's in, from Columbia University, and holds a PhD from the New School in New York City. She's done research in the US, Germany, Israel, and she's really just a wonderful addition to our faculty. We're very glad to have her, and she'll be speaking today on the topic of loyalty, belonging, and treason, questioning Israeli national identity, which is also the subject of her doctoral dissertation. And I think everybody who's wanting to sign up has signed up. So Hadas, please take it away.
Okay, so hi, Alan. Thank you for this introduction, and hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your lunch hour and coming to hear me speak about one of my favorite topics, which is treason. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and yes, perfect. So, and I will just begin and do my best to keep it under 40 minutes. Wow, that's quite a tall order. Okay, so in this talk, I would like to examine 4 cases of 4 Jewish Israeli citizens that were perceived in Israel as traitors, both legally and publicly. And the theories that I want to make use of in order to understand what actually happened here and deconstruct these cases are theories that talk about citizenship in Israel. And I'm going to go into that in a second. And and what basically I want to ask is, what do these cases of 2 women, 2 men, 2 of Ashkenazi, meaning European descent, and 2 of Middle Eastern descent, expose to us or show us regarding the social contracts that different groups in Israel have, and what happens when there are intersectionality of different identity markers of these supposedly traitors. I'm going to say in quote traitors because I'll show in a second why it is a contested question. But what I want to claim is that basically acts of treason both demonstrate and strengthen stratified and hierarchical citizenship of those perceived as traitors. And I started out asking, why was there such a huge media attack on them? And why was what was discussed was mostly what they betrayed and not what they exposed. And what I'm saying is that what I'm claiming is that they didn't just betray the state security, but something much larger, or something else that has to do what is the state and who is included. So in other words, what is the common good of the Israeli state? So here they are, my 4 traitors, 2 men and 2 women, Middle Eastern descent and Ashkenazi, 2 from the periphery, the hegemonic center, and 2 from the periphery. And again, I will go into that in a second. And what, again, I'm going to show, and hopefully will demonstrate adequately, is that the response to their cases didn't have to do as much as with what they have done, but with their identity markers and also their ability to cross back and be a part of Israeli society also had to do and be included or not included in the Israeli society had to do a lot with their identity marker. So treason is a very, to start with the law, basically. So treason is a very unique offense. So unlike murder or theft, the context is very, the framework is very clear. We all understand what betraying the country means, but the context changes according to the historical, political, social context, and an act of treason that would be considered to be such in one context will be considered to be heroism in another context. And to bring the most extreme example, think of all of those people, Germans, who lived during Nazi regime, who betrayed the nation, who betrayed that regime when they were helping Jews or they were opposing the Nazi regime. And we consider them today heroes. And so in Israel, one of the 2 or the worst offenses that one could be accused of is treason. And indeed, the death penalty that does not exist officially in Israel exists only in 2 cases. One is for Nazis and their assistants, and the second one is for treason. And this is supposed to be a very, as I said, a neutral offense. And here we have the law, Article 99 starts to deal with this. It's in the second part. I'm not going to go into the details of the law, but basically here we see the offenses that are considered to be treasonous offenses that allot the death penalty. And to run through it, it's planning to impair the sovereignty of the state, whether inside the state or outside of it, having the intent to cause war or to help an enemy to basically create a military action against Israel. And and I'm gonna go to the second part that I want to show you. Also very important is assistance to the enemy and giving the enemy information. So on the face of it, it seems that the law is very clear about what will be considered traitorous acts, but a deeper look shows us that basically the legislator left quite a few important terms, very general, such as assistance, such as intent, such as sovereignty, such as enemy, such as knowing, and let the judges decide on that. So so this is the legal framework, and what I'm claiming is that the ideology of the state, the kind of nationalism that exists in the state that basically merits loyalty and merits what it means to be a good citizen, will supply with context all of these terms that I have just labeled. So to talk about Israel, because these cases take place in Israel, the Declaration of Independence state, and also a bunch of basic laws. We don't have a constitution in Israel, but we have basic laws, basically that says that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. It posits these 2 as ideological poles that basically in between exists Israeli citizenship. And what I am saying and what I will show is that these poles are very much affected by the identity markers of the citizens. And in Israel, and basically, we'll talk for a second about Zionism. It is the ideology that is behind the state of Israel, and what it does is that it ascribes different kind of differential and hierarchical citizenship that is based on ethnicity, on gender, and on peripherality. Yeah, so in Israel also there are, very generally speaking, much has been theorized about that. There are two kinds of citizenship. The first one is the liberal one that gives citizens rights and is neutral regarding the ethnic, the national, the cultural, the religious identities. In other words, everyone is equal in front of the law. But also in parallel, we have Republican kind of citizenship, which is basically what the idea behind it is that your rights exist within a collective identity. And this Republican citizenship enhances the cultural identity and ascribes a set of values that are perceived to be common good. Now in Israel, this common good has to do with land, the whole of Israel or part of Israel. The aspiration is for the whole of Israel, with security, and the army. So in other words, loyalty to these terms, and also a homogenic Jewish state. Yeah, and what I am going to do right now I'm going to go into the analysis of the cases themselves, is I'm going to use intersectionality as an analytic strategy to basically look at where each one of these traders could be found in terms of their identity markers, and how what they did was a challenge to the hierarchy of Israeli citizenship. So yeah, and what I want to basically, what I'm claiming is that the motivation of these four was the motivation and what propelled them to do what they did was because they were loyal to the liberal set to the liberal citizenship. In other words, they wanted to give the same rights that exist for Jews in Israel to Palestinians or to Arabs or to the whole world. We'll see that. But the way that the state reacted was from a place of Republican citizenship. So in other words, emphasizing the common good. And now we see that the hierarchical citizenship that I described before that has to do with the identity markers, has to do with their ability to come back and be a part of Israeli society. So to start and make it much less theoretical and much more concrete, this is Udi Adiv. I call him the romantic revolutionary. He was from a kibbutz. He was served in the Nahal, an elite unit in the Israeli army. He went to study. He was one of the soldiers that released the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, basically was part of conquering East Jerusalem in the 1966 war. And the kibbutz that he grew up with was a very socialist kibbutz. And the idea of socialism is that basically, I mean, we all know what it is, but back in the day in Israel was very much about having a proletariat, it's much closer to Marxism than socialism is seen today or perceived today. And it was about people working the land. I mean, the kibbutz members working the land and so on. So after finishing the army service, Adiv went to study philosophy and Middle Eastern studies in Tel Aviv University, where he became associated with Matzpen, which is a Marxist group that he basically supported the whole notion of extending this socialist idea only from that it will including the Jewish citizens of the Israeli state to include the proletariat all over the Middle East. So in other words, what Adiv ideology was, what motivated him was saying, okay, if we're talking about the workers of the world uniting against the bourgeoisie, let's not talk only about Jewish workers, let's talk about workers regardless of their religion. So he traveled clandestinely to Damascus and Athens to meet PLO resistance leader, and he was also very much into making contacts with whom he thought were counterparts in parallel Arab countries and in parallel in Palestinian countries. And yeah, so he, but the thing is, like, what is very interesting about these cases of these traders is that when venturing into this world of trying to make change, they also ventured into a world of espionage and double agents and organizations that use them for their own needs. And yeah, for instance, he was in touch with Kahawaji, whom he thought that was a Marxist Palestinian, and that turned out to be a double agent for the Syrian regime. So in December of 1972, Adiv was arrested with about 60 other activists, and I want to show you here translation of an article of the shock in Israel, because this was also, we need to remember, this was right after the Yom Kippur War, the 1972 war, where Israel was almost basically extinct, and the finding out this, what was labeled as a joint spying, shook Israel. So here I have a quote: Udi Adiv, a kibbutz member and a paratrooper, took part in liberating the Western Wall, has been convicted in espionage for Syria, and has become known as a spy, as a traitor. He collaborated with radical organizations hoping to topple the Israeli regime. So there, what we can see here is there is none of the claims or what motivated him, none of that is mentioned. And that is basically cuts across almost all of the media coverage of the case. So Adiv said that he did not give when he went to Syria, he didn't give the Syrian army any information that was detrimental, that was significant. And what he basically wanted was an Israeli-Palestinian revolution in the spirit of Mao. So let me see what else is important here. So the indictment against Adiv included severe espionage, giving enemy top secret documents to the enemy, contact with an enemy agent, and the trial was held, unsurprisingly, with closed doors. He was sentenced for 17 years in jail, and he was released after 12 years. He repented publicly. And very interestingly, he went afterwards, he went to Birkbeck University in England to study, to do a PhD. And afterwards, he came back to Israel, where he became not a tenure track professor, but an adjunct. And I don't know if any of you know Israeli academia. Even that is very hard to get. So basically, in here we see here another media covered piece that says, once a spy and today a professor, in the Open University. And it's interesting because when I presented this in Israel, this talk, so somebody from the audience remarked that, well, but he doesn't have pension and he doesn't have, but he's employed, he has access to the youth. So basically what we see here, so to this Ashkenazi, European descent, men from a very prestigious kibbutz, he was forgiven. He was forgiven for his romantic youth misconduct. And he was allowed to come back into Israeli society and become an active member. By the way, other members of that spy ring, like Dan Vered, for instance, another Jewish Israeli man, is a math teacher working with teenagers, so in high school. So again, we see that not only were they allowed to come back, but they have access to, to the younger generation. Okay, and a strike contrast. This is the next case, which is Mordechai Vanunu, who was the Israeli atom whistleblower. I'm sure that many of you have heard about him. And again, it's very different, both in terms of his identity, also the time of when it happened. It wasn't after a war. It was much more a calmer time. So let's go through who Vanunu was. So Mordechai Vanunu, today known as John Crossman, he converted to Christianity, was born in 1954 in Morocco. He to a family with 11 siblings, and then they moved to Israel when he was 8. And he did not live in a very prestigious kibbutz, but he rather lived in Be'er Sheva, in a very poor neighborhood called Shikun Daled. Again, anyone familiar with the Israeli context, I think there were movies made about the poor lives in Shikun Daled. And yeah, and then he in the army, he was, he didn't do anything spectacular, but after he finished his army service, he became basically a nuclear technician, and he joined the Dimona, the Israeli power plant. And again, right now, I have to say that a lot of these things that I'll be talking about, especially the more contemporary parts, are classified. So what I'm taking is what has been described in the international media and Israeli media. And basically what Vanunu did was, well, eventually what he did was to come out against the Israeli policy regarding nuclear weapons, which is not to admit and not to deny that the country has nuclear weapons. And yeah, so he worked, he as I said, he worked at the Israeli power plant in Dimona, and he became politically active. For him, he became radicalized to the left during his studies at the university. But then he decided that it was his duty to expose to the world that Israel has nuclear capabilities. So in other words, he became a nuclear, basically anti-nuclear power activist. And for somebody from his background, it just didn't fit. There was nobody like him that were of Middle Eastern descent and poor and from the Israeli periphery that would be active in such things. And I believe that until today, there is, I know that's stratified like that. Anyway, so what he did is that in 1985, he quit and he took over 60 pictures of the power plant that basically proved that Israel had the ability to produce nuclear weapons. He flew to Thailand and then to Nepal and then to Australia, and he converted to Christianity. And at some point, one of his contacts put him in touch with the Sunday Times, the British Sunday Times, that offered him $75,000 for the story and the pictures. Now, this was at the end, the aftermath of this, a very, very helpful point for the judges, because they said, oh, he did that for, because he was motivated by money. But again, so this is a good question whether that was actually the case or not. He went to London to talk about to interview to the Sunday Times, and where he met Cindy, Mossad agent, that we're gonna see her in a second. My PowerPoint is quite slow. Oh, there we go. She's there. She and who basically they had an affair and or a few dates, and she convinced him to travel with her to Rome. They went, and there she was, he was kidnapped by the Mossad, brought to Israel and stood trial. Just as an asterisk, I want to say that it's really interesting and also relevant to the next part of my talk, how when a woman uses her body in order to seduce a man, it's considered to be an act of loyalty as long as it's done for the state, while if she does it because, or she's perceived to have been done it for her own motivation, it's perceived to be an act of treason. So to go back to Vanunu, his trial was held in closed doors. By the way, here we see a very famous photograph of Vanunu that he wrote when he was kidnapped. He wrote on his hand and he put it against the window of the car. Anyway, so the trial was held and behind closed doors, and the judges were very much in a way relieved to say that, oh, Vanunu wasn't only motivated by ideological reasons, but also for money. He was sentenced to 18 years in jail, 11 years in isolation, and he was released. And after his release, he was arrested for several times for violations of these restrictions that basically say that he's not allowed to leave the country. He's not allowed to leave his foreign journalists for more than half an hour. And so there was a whole row of restrictions that he did not, that, by the way, Udi Adiv did not have at all. And if we think about it, Udi Adiv traveled to Syria to meet with Syrian, and Israel was at war with Syria at the time. So, and after again, Yom Kippur War, where one of the main forces that almost caused the destruction of Israel was the Syrian army. Anyway, so unlike Adiv, Anunu never repented. And over and over, the media discussed how about his background and how could it be that somebody from Be'er Sheva and from a large family in Mizrahi, all of a sudden, that came to Israel from Morocco, all of a sudden can become a pacifist. Where did that come from? And they said that he did not finish his high school studies and that he became secular. He was Jewish. So yeah, it's really interesting how the whole perception of him was there was a much more angrier reaction. And what happened is that also the Anunu excluded himself from Israeli society, again by converting to Christianity, which he did before, but also even today in Israel, which he lives in Israel, he is not very much of the mainstream in any way. So what I want to say is that while Adiv extended or stretched the socialist ideology of the kibbutz and socialist Israel, that basically, and so the kibbutz that he came from, I mean, there was a connection to an autobiographical connection. Well, for Va'anunu, there wasn't. And not just that, as a Middle Eastern, as an Arab Jew, what Va'anunu did was allude to a completely different kind of danger, which is the danger of Middle Eastern Jews that immigrated to Israel identifying with the Arab part or the Middle Eastern part of their identity and not the Israeli part. Because if you think about it, a lot of Middle Eastern Jews in Israel, citizens, immigrated from Syria, not from Syria, mostly from Egypt and from the Middle East and North Africa. And these were countries that with some of them, Israel was at war. So how could it be this radical psychological change that there was a requirement to go through it really quickly. So yeah, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more when I'm going to talk about the case of Tali Fahima. I wrote my PhD dissertation about her case. And basically, it is very hard to summarize this case, but of course, like everything, this whole talk, I will do my best. So this is a Jewish Israeli woman of Middle Eastern descent, very much like Va'anunu, that during the second Intifada, it also comes from a very poor neighborhood in Israel, Kiryat Gat. She grew up in her mom cleaned houses, still does. Her dad and her parents are separated, so her mom raised her and her family by herself. So definitely not in the mainstream, definitely not somebody that would go to Tel Aviv University and study Foucault and would know to have this discourse of equality. So basically in 2004, the height of the second Intifada that was taking place in Israel, when suicide bombings shook the streets and buses and coffee shops and restaurants. So Tali Fahima came out in an interview in an Israeli newspaper saying that she will be the human shield I have a Palestinian terrorist. We will see him in a second. Terrorist again, very interesting character called Zakaria Zbeidi, who was the head of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades in Jenin. Now, I have to say that Jenin at that time was a hub of suicide bombing labs. So basically that's where they produced the bombs that would go into the belts, that would go into, and then the suicide bombers would go on buses and so on. So, and what happened is that what Tali Fahima told me in the interviews and what she has also declared in the newspaper is that she was really interested in the general question of why do they hate us so much? And she was also very interested to know, I mean, to his story, because Zbeidi grew up in Jenin and was part of a theater group, the Jenin Theater Group, and he she contacted him after reading about his life story, and then she started to visit him in Jenin, and where they became good friends. Now, as you can imagine, the Israeli media, of course, depicted both of them as a couple, and she refused to talk about it. Zbeidi was married with a child, that none of that mattered. After a while, I'm going to run through the case. After a while, Fahima was held in administrative detention, which was the first time that a Jewish Israeli woman, that this legal tool was used against a Jewish Israeli woman. And administrative detention is a very severe legal tool because the detainee does not have access to the evidence against them. And in many cases, they don't have access to the indictment itself, all of that because of secrecy. And yeah, so she was held in isolation for a while, and she was, and basically she was, after 4 months, she was charged with treason because she was accused of translating this top secret military document. Again, was in Israel, published in Yediot Ahronot, a newspaper in print and both online. That's where I got this. And the top secret military document reached the hands of Zbeidi and his men when she was with them. There was a military the activity in the camp, and a few soldiers died, and somehow this reached their hands with him. Two Palestinians that were there at the time testified that she translated that document that we see here. This is what it says: Operation Alligator Tears, and there were photos of 4 different men. This is Zbeidi here, and basically what it says is their name, their idea, what year they were born, a short description, and what kind of weapons they might have. So something that they would very much know about themselves. It also included a military map that I'm not showing, even though it was again in the newspaper. And yeah, so it was very interesting to see what how the judges, or specifically one judge, Eliakim Rubinstein, talked about the anticipation or the expectation from Jewish Israelis of even if she did not know, in terms of what to do in this situation, if she's there and the top secret military document reaches there. So if she didn't know, she didn't have any military background to understand specifically what those maps meant. And even if they knew Hebrew, the other Palestinians around her, to be able to translate the document on their own. And so even if she didn't per se assist in them, just her presence there was enough to basically assist the enemy. So in other words, what she was judged for was having an ideological intent and not necessarily having done something concretely. She was, I met with her lawyer, and they initiated basically a plea bargain. And the lawyer, Smadar Benatan, told me that she felt that if she would not initiate that plea bargain, that Fahima could go to jail for a very long time, very many years. And indeed, when the trial started, the judge asked the prosecution, do you intend to demand the death penalty for her? So what Fahima touched on were basically 2 very important identity markers that caused this extreme reaction towards her. And I don't have time right now to show the media response, and how there was a journal in her hometown of Kiryat Gat basically saying, how could this be that this girl from Kiryat Gat became a lefty? She's not from Tel Aviv. She's not from Shenkin. It's like a neighborhood in Tel Aviv. So it doesn't make sense. They must have, put this on her. So, so we have here, she's not only of Middle Eastern descent, and this basically echoes what I said before about Vanunu being loyal to the Middle Eastern part or the Arab part versus the Israeli part or Jewish part, but she's also a woman, and women are border markers of the community. If she's penetrated, the whole community is penetrated in a way, and they help to maintain the purity of the nation. So, yeah, and again, this was, so on the one hand, being a woman was very helpful because, and basically labeling the relationship she had with Zbeidi as romantic gave a reason to why she did what she did. But on the other hand, it also raised this whole anxiety about mixed relationships. And one of the biggest taboos in Israel is mixed relationship, particularly between Jewish women and Palestinian or Arab men. So, and to go to my last case, again, very different, another woman, but I call her the Israeli military whistleblower, Anat Kam. And what she comes from a very different background, from Tarif Chima, from Jerusalem, middle upper class, Ashkenazia, in other words, of European descent, went to a really good school. Her mom was a social worker, her dad was an insurance agent. So none of that peripherality, and in terms also not just geography, but also class, but a very strong middle class. And indeed, Kam had very ambitious aspirations. She was a journalist during high school, and she wanted to she wanted to become a pilot, and she was not accepted. And she was sent to be a clerk, basically a secretary in the Kirya, the military base in Tel Aviv. And she was very disappointed that she did not get the very exciting and challenging military service. And that time, the Israeli Supreme Court came out and said that before the Israeli army can carry out targeted assassinations of Palestinians, terrorists with blood on their hands, they need to do a bunch of things, including trying to bring them. The army has to bring them, first of all, to be tried. They have to warn them, and a whole bunch of things. And basically, what come when she was in her service, in the military service, she saw that the army was not complying with these demands. So she burned on a CD 2,000 military documents showing that. 700 of them were on highly classified. And after she was released for the army, she gave them to Uri Blau, and a journalist from Haaretz, that got permission from the Israeli security services, the Shin Bet, to publish them in Haaretz, and he did. Now, after the publication happened, the Shin Bet, the security services, decided to revoke this what they allowed, the permission to publish. And they called him to their office and said, you have to tell us who the source is. He did. She sued him afterwards, and Haaretz newspaper, for revealing that, because she said, you were mandated to maintain my identity, or not to reveal it. And yeah, and basically so this is targeted assassinations, but I think let's see the material that revealed by Kam. So here, this is a quote from Haaretz newspaper. Forget about the Israeli Supreme Court's instructions, told the Haaretz commanding general Yair Naveh. I want you to strike and kill the targeted men directly, without wasting time, without dilly-dallying. And here, in Kam's own words, I think it's really interesting to see how she viewed herself. There were aspects to the IDF activity in the West Bank and Gaza that I thought the Israeli public should know. I thought that in the test of history, that people who warned about war crimes were forgiven. I tried to change things, she said, during the military service. I couldn't, so I thought that if I would bring them to light, it would change the IDF's policies in the territories. So basically, what would come was, it's very similar to what Tali Fahima and also Vanunu were trying to do, was just to like basically expose things and hoping that the public will help them and will create public pressure on the army or on the through the media. None of that happened. She also finished her trial also ended with a plea bargain, and she repented very much so. And yeah, and then so when the judges, again, they didn't discuss anything that she brought up. And it's interesting because the Israeli Supreme Court came up with that verdict, or a row of verdicts, saying that what the army needs to do. The judges completely ignored that. But what they did talk about is her breaching trust as a soldier. So, and then the judge says very artistically, I would say, she did not have to penetrate to in a dangerous commando action into secret military base, or cut wires to crawl into centers of command. She was already there in the Kiryat, that military base. And as such, she breached the army's trust and the trust of her commanders. And Judge Folcacha goes on to explain what this trust means. And a soldier in mandatory military service cannot do self-justice. We cannot have soldiers carry out, use their own discretion to decide what is legal, what is not. Doesn't matter whether it's because of tikkun olam or not. We simply cannot have it. And what was the redeeming factor, or the different social contract that Kam had that was very different from Fahima? She was from Ashkenazi descent, middle upper class, and there was where to put her, because her profile belongs to that of other peace activists. If you look at women's peace activist groups in Israel, yeah, you find there many Kams. You almost don't find Fahima. And indeed, after she was released from jail after 4.5 years, she became a journalist in Liberal, and a magazine called Liberal, again having access to shaping public opinion. And another thing that she did not betray is that Uri Blau, the journalist, was Jewish. So there was no crossing the lines in terms of using the body for something that she saw as appropriate or perceived. So to conclude in the 2-3 minutes that I have, theories of intersectionality basically help understand fear of places, the places of those that are in the margins and the agency that they have. But what I want to say is that the margins and these theories of intersectionality, what I'm doing here is an opposite move, which is going from the margins to the center to the hegemony, and seeing how there is the margins instruct the center as to how to behave. So the 4 cases are Jewish Israeli citizens that just got confused in the hierarchy of citizenship. They thought that they could be loyal to the liberal citizenship and not to the Republican citizenship, and because of that, nobody really listened to them. If you think about Snowden's case, I'm not going to go into it. I'm just saying that, referring that, it's Snowden is willing today to come to the United States and be judged. So he's assuming, but that's not being allowed to him. But if it will be an open court hearing, and so he's assuming that the American public will basically be convinced by what he has to say, and basically, so this was not the case in Israel. And also what the 4 did was, in particularly the women, is that basically didn't play according to the rules of the game, according to the identity politics of the allowed to them in the Israeli Republic. And I'm using Republic on purpose. Women are supposed to be mothers and not to deal with security. Middle Easterners are supposed to be very loyal to the Jewish state. Soldiers are supposed to be loyal to the Jewish state and not to Palestinian. And then by labeling what they did as traitorous and not without basically talking about what they have exposed, depoliticized their actions. And yeah, so I think that this is it. I have a little bit more, but I know we're done with 40 minutes. So yeah, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So